Hello, everyone. We will give it another minute and we will start. Okay, hello, everyone. Welcome to the second and last day of interior speculation. My name is Nikkar. I'm a co-course leader of BA Interior Architecture and Design at NTU. I will be chairing this meeting. Today, first we will have Douglas Gittens, one of our senior lecturers. His presentation title is Ethnicity of the Perspective and Representation of Interior. It will be followed by a Q&A. After the Q&A, our amazing final year students, Lily and Saskia, will present. First presentation is by Saskia once. Title of her presentation is Ethnography, Activism and the Old Market Square. Then Lily Riley will give a talk on social housing and the North Kensington community. We will have a 20-minute Q&A, and we will have our keynote speaker, amazing Carolina Rito. Professor Carolina Rito is a researcher and curator whose work is situated at the intersection between knowledge production, the curatorial and contested historical narratives. The presentation title is Inside Out Practice Research. Some housekeeping, we are recording the session, but audience won't be in the recording. And if you have any question, please put them in the Q&A. So our first speaker is Douglas Gittens. Douglas is a published researcher and a senior lecturer at Nottingham Trent University, where he teaches on the BA Interior Architecture and Design program. He has taught design for over 20 years. Douglas' research explores the continuing significance of sketchbook and hand drawing as a creative tool in the digital age. I will hand it over to Douglas.
Thank you. Thanks, Nikoo. Yeah, so it's a pleasure to do this today, and well, time is of the essence, so I'll just crack straight on. So if I just share my screen. And hopefully go to full screen. I'll just check. Can everybody can you see that okay?
Yeah, we've gone to full screen.
Okay, so the title of this talk is Authenticity of Perspective and Representations of the Interior. And it's a research project I'm working on at the moment, so it's something that's coming into being. It's partly completed, partly not completed. And yeah, so the project really began by me asking which is the more authentic representation of a designed interior, the hand-drawn presentation perspective or the CGI image. Then found myself questioning the authenticity of the presentation perspective itself. So when we're thinking about definitions of authenticity, the dictionary defines it as being true in substance and as being what it professes in origin or authorship, as being genuine. Existentialist thinking can help us a little bit with this as well via Kierkegaard and Heidegger and Sartre, concluding with Sartre, who kind of concludes by saying that it's almost impossible to be authentic as a human being. Obviously, as an existentialist, is thinking about the nature of existence and being in the world, and because as human beings we have to socially interact and we form social contracts with other people, that in some way compromises our authenticity, in that we can't be our true selves because we have to kind of roles to play within society and with other people. So existence by its nature demands negotiation and compromise to some extent. The same can be said of human artifacts. They're produced within complex human and sociological frameworks, and so the things that we make have a compromised thingness in terms of authenticity. They're not truly a thing in itself. They have degrees of authenticity and inauthenticity. This sketch I put on here was a quick line drawing back when I was in practice in 1991. The perspective is, well, a little bit out, and the point really is that I'm making here is that just the speed at which we used to produce these things to churn them out of the office. And of course this isn't an authentic representation. It's a scan of an original drawing, so it's a reproduction in that sense. But the original drawing has some authenticity about it because, you know, I drew it with my hands on a piece of paper with a pen. And but also it carries inauthenticity within it as well, in that you know, the figures at the front of this really convey it as some kind of really fun place to be, when in actual fact it probably isn't. Benjamin's aura, he talks about in the work of art in the age of mechanical reproduction, classic essay. He talks about the aura in there, the aura of the original artwork. And this is kind of linked to the time and place of the artwork. And he draws a very clear distinction to mechanically reproduced photographic images or replications of the original artwork. So this kind of indicates that there's within human artisanship, that generates authenticity just from the kind of agency of producing the work, the designerly agency, the physical marks, and the realness of the drawing as a made object. And again, this is a perspective drawing I did in 2008 with markers. Willem Flusser, when he dissects the etymology of the words design and artist, starts to kind of take this apart though, because he portrays designers and design drawings, or he associates them with cunning deception and designers laying traps. So artists and draftspeople conduct magic and sleight of hand. They act as conjurers and tricksters in the way that they produce these images. So the questions arising from this, I found myself asking are, is hand-drawn perspective more authentic because of its aura? Is hand-drawn perspective essentially visual trickery, a kind of pre-digital simulation of the space? And does the accuracy of CGI imagery, particularly that produced through BIM software, provide greater authenticity by merit of its facticity, in other words, its factualness? It's important to remember all CGI is a simulation of a simulation, in that it's a simulated photograph of a simulated building. So how authentic can such a simulation be? Really cherry picking the history of perspective here, but I feel I've got to kind of go through a bit of this. So there's natural perspective and artificial perspective. So natural perspective is how we see the world through the lens of the eye. This was evidenced by Brunelleschi with his famous mirror experiment of 1420. I'm not going to go into that in a great deal of detail, but basically used a mirror, a drawing he did, and kind of made that work in the real world as he was looking at the real world combined with the drawing. So natural perspective is also captured through the camera, which was originally the camera obscura, the pinhole camera, if you've ever made one of those, and other Renaissance perspective machine Juras here, 1525, and all these devices essentially captured perspective as we see it in the real world. Alberti theorised and rationalised artificial perspective as a geometric construction or drawn projection in the art of painting in 1434 to 36. Some would claim he literally more rediscovered it, really. In that it creates proportionally correct diminishing horizontals. So we have natural perspective, which is captured through the lens. So this is the life world projected into representational ideal. An artificial perspective, which is generated through geometric projection on a flat sheet of paper, which is a representational idea projected into the life world. Interestingly, Alberti draws a very clear distinction between using perspective in paintings and for communicating an architectural design. Architectural drawing is perceived as a Vitruvian architectural idea, so the drawing and the idea are the same thing. This kind of owes itself to ideas of Platonic idealism and the ideal forms of Plato. And perspective is seen as a distortion of the idea, the architectural idea, and also a distortion of the architectural and cosmological order of Renaissance architecture. For Alberti, architecture is best conveyed through the icographia, which is the plan, the orthographia or elevation. Excuse the pidgin Italian here, but il profile, which is the section, and the sciographia, which is a shadow section. Of course, lots of us will use these today to communicate our spaces with. So essentially for Alberti, perspective twists architectural integrity. These views are also held by Barbaro, Palladio and Michelangelo. Big jump here to the Enlightenment. So in the Enlightenment, we saw the generation of a new engagement perspective as a vehicle for articulating the architectural idea. And during the age of reason and science, i.e. modernity, perspective was seen as a mathematical system for capturing the visual world. We see here a 19th century architectural publication of three-point perspective by Parsi. Again, this starts to look quite photographic, kind of similar era in many ways. And here we see the presentation of the architectural idea to clients and patrons. So this essentially becomes a simulation of the building to be. And as Perez Gomez and Pelletier say, they evolve into illusionist drawings, delusions in fact, and waver self-consciously between truth and deception. So during the 19th century, with the arrival of the camera lucidia and photography, one was a drawing aid, and obviously photography is a camera. This enables the capturing of perspective for the layperson, so you don't have to be an artist or an architect to be able to produce perspective. And in architecture, interestingly, there's a shift away from using perspective again to represent architecture. So there's also the influence of engineering projections via the industrialization of society. So the isometric and axonometric drawings, which are essentially engineering drawings, become the preferred mode of representation. You can see here one by Auguste Choisy, dates currently hidden by Nikoo's lovely image, 1873. And within the modernist movement, the isometric and axonometric drawings attain a privileged position, and they're considered to be a truer, proportionally correct representation than perspective. Oops. Meanwhile, elsewhere in the world, interior design has begun to emerge as a distinct profession to that of architecture. And we find in mid-19th century furniture supply catalogues, furniture suppliers and upholsterers that is, they offer home decoration advice via mass-produced publications. So in these, thematic views were presented that enabled a new urban and mainly female clientele to reimagine their domestic landscapes. So the interior perspective becomes a mediator of bourgeois taste in the industrial age. You can see here with this James Shulbred furniture catalogue of 1876. This is a drawing room furnished and decorated in the old English style. So various styles were available, deeply kind of colonial way of looking at things by today's standards. So there was kind of oriental styles and things like this that you could order for your room. So as a broker of middle class values and taste, the interior perspective embodies the interior as product. The interior view has become essentially a consumer-centered agent of design fantasy. And again, this makes me think about Flusser's notion of the trick of the hand. And it becomes a vehicle for channeling consumerist desire. And I would argue that images like these wonderful watercolours here by Walton and obviously Charles Rennie Mackintosh and Margaret MacDonald, they in themselves become objects of desire in their own right. This is by Gilbert Road, Design for a Living Room, 1935. And this is actually from a paint company catalogue, the head teacher's office on the right there, called The Function of Colour in Factories, Schools and Hospitals. The paint company later became Berger. And there was this sort of suggestion from these drawings, one of a domestic space, one of a kind of civic space in a school. That this is what your interior will feel like. This is the dream we want to give you. This is what the possibilities are for your new environment. So interior design industry matured following World War II, and interior visualization was transformed by US design agency culture. You think of Mad Men, for example. So industrial design and commercial interior design tend to blend together for a while, and the interior perspective adopts a slick kind of graphic quality associated with design agency visualization and marketing. And it hooks into new roles more aligned to sales and marketing. So it conveys corporate identity, retail styling, advertising, design promotion. Essentially, it becomes an agent of fantasy and design idealism. Arguably, I think these evolve into surrogate photographs for selling the dream or desire of an interior design. Essentially, it becomes a marketing tool. So as a simulation of consumerist and corporate fantasy, how authentic is the hand-drawn perspective? Fleur's analysis of the etymology of the word design. The word occurs in contexts associated with cunning and deceit. A designer is a cunning plotter laying his traps. Here we've got a couple of images from Knoll catalogues. So this is Knoll Associates, the furniture and interior design company of the 1960s. These are treated photographs. And so this is kind of chimera really of photography and perspective drawing, wavering somewhere between authentic representation and glossy magazine advert. And they kind of waver between truth and deception in some ways. So CGI. Is CGI a truer representation of the virtual building, conveying all its features, materials and lighting? Well, CGI is a representation of a photograph of a virtual building or a virtual interior. A digital render is a virtual photograph of a building yet to become, or an interior space yet to become, essentially a simulation of a simulation. It's also subject to designers or illustrators' enhancement or enhancing the CGI to create an idealised view through post-production techniques. So we see here with these ones by Blank Canvas Studio that in the lower one, the sky and the landscape have been enhanced to kind of create this, I suppose, more idyllic landscape and outlook from this apartment. So in interviews I've had with designers, that revealed that hand drawing carries designerly agency. Drawing is what clients expect the designers to do. They also said that where hand drawing is a discussion, in that it's an idea in becoming, CGI is a tell, it's a resolution. And that the seduction of hand drawing conveys designerly craft skill and originality and sells an idea at that first juncture. The apparent accuracy of CGI essentially tells the idea. They also said that CGI is considered to be more authentic by merit of its computational accuracy. Hand drawing conveys design activity and designerly agency. And so, does a hand drawing possess an aura, an original work by an artisan? Does it have a human hand evident in its making that gives it this aura? Or do both CGI and hand drawn images perform the same magical trick? They create a seductive virtual illusion, a kind of seductive dream of the space. Whether hand-drawn or CGI, the perspective image seems to have far more in common with lens-based simulations, that of photography in Hollywood, rather than being a true or real representation. So how authentic is such an image? Is it authentic at all? And does this discussion even matter? So some concluding observations. Historically, the perspective is considered a distortion of architectural purity. It is also subject to all forms of external drivers that prevent full authenticity. It cannot be a fully authentic representation, but only embodies degrees of authenticity. Interior perspective hand drawing functions as a marketing device that facilitates a fantasy of the interior and is therefore not a fully authentic representation. I believe it's something more than this. It's the designer's legerdemain, a kind of skillful use of one's hands when performing conjuring tricks. So therefore it wavers between reality and fantasy, truth and deception, authenticity and inauthenticity. I think the same critique applies to CGI and associated VR and AR technologies. The sensations of realness that we owe more to our familiarity with the simulations offered through lens and screen projections. So, do these images have to be the purveyors of truth and authenticity? And does it matter if they're only half-truths? It seems to me that they fulfill a complex role in the commercial gameplay of bringing designs into being, the cost of which is their own authenticity. And that's the end of the talk. There's also a brief reading list here, should anybody be interested. So, thank you.
Thank you so much, Doug. We have a question from one of the audience. Has the COVID-19 pandemic affected your research finding? As we inevitably move to more hybrid of home working and studio collaboration, do you foresee that we are going to continue to see more photorealistic methods, beam rendering and less sketch in practice as a result of the pandemic? I personally have found that specifically in industry and the shift to digital home working, that I've lost the need to sketch and subsequently design has lost authenticity. I definitely miss quick collaborative sketching during design team meetings.
Yeah, that's quite a lot there. What was the first part again?
So has the COVID-19 pandemic affected your research findings?
Not that I'm aware of. Basically, I need to get out there again and start to interview some more people to find out what the situation is now. Yeah, but it is also a call to volunteers. If there's any designers out there that would like to contribute, I'd be very welcome to hear from you. It would be fantastic. But I would say that quite possibly, you know, if you think about the designers that we were looking at there and the way that they use hand-drawn perspective now, it's very much a sort of collaborative process, a kind of team discussion moment. And also, I think for clients, I think the important thing that's come through to me from designers is that clients think that designers draw things by hand. And it's almost used as a marketing tool in itself. It's marketing the designer's skill, the designer's aura. So I think I would imagine that back in the office and certainly with meetings with clients, they'll want to see that they're getting a designer, not a computer. And in that sense, I think that that sense of the perspective at work will persist in all sorts of ways, yeah.
So to go to the next point of the question, so do you foresee that we are going to continue to see more photorealistic methods, beam rendering and less sketching in practice as a result? Or do you think that like the sketching will be kind of
I think it's inevitable that the computer render will prevail as a presentation technique. I think really what I'm trying to do here is offer a critique of that and saying, you know, well, hang on, you know, this isn't, you know, is this reality? Right? On what terms are we saying this is an authentic representation? And I think the role of the hand drawing has completely changed. I mean, if you look at my early research, which, you know, has dealt with this in some depth, the role of the hand drawn perspective has completely changed. I guess the point I'm trying to make here is that actually they're both agents of deception and deceit in many ways.
Yeah, it seems like Harry have a question.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, thanks, Doug. Really great talk. Really good to hear about it. I think, yeah, maybe you kind of partly answered it, I think, but you mentioned kind of etymology, and I suppose just coming back to, you know, etymologically thinking about design and how, you know, way back when it would refer to the drawings themselves as opposed to necessarily the architecture, the actual building. And I just wonder, as time's gone on and kind of divisions of labor have been separated when it comes to visualizations, we have kind of professional visualizers who get very often now from architectural practices. I just wonder how you feel about their presence and their emergence now, you know, in terms of authenticity, because just thinking about some of those visualizers may not be from architectural or interior design backgrounds, for example.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the interesting thing for me was that looking, I don't know whether you recall the Arthur Persay 3-point perspective drawing there. He didn't draw that. That was actually an engraving. So it was produced by a professional engraver and mass produced. And that wasn't uncommon. That artists were employed by architects to visualize their ideas, you know, even in the early 1800s. It's something of you know, within an architectural practice, Often, you know, underlings, apprentices would learn to draw in the way of the master. So if you think of Frank Lloyd Wright's beautiful drawings that he used to do, you know, there is some dispute about who actually produced them. Whether, I'm sure some of them were produced by him, but they may well have been produced by people in the practice who'd learned to draw like he did. And as well, you know, I've done it for a living. You know, I used to charge anything between, you know, £300 and £1,000 for a watercolour visual 30 years ago. So I think there's always been this tradition of the visualization being something that's produced by an external agent or a technician or an expert, you know, an artist in the field. So, because often architects aren't that good at it, and interior designers aren't that great at it. So I think, yeah, it will continue to be, as it has been. The fact that it's done on the computer is neither here nor there, really. Does that answer that?
Yep, that's great. Thanks, Doug.
We have another question. With the emergence of digital rendering and it's photorealistic, do you feel, are we losing the importance of plan section elevations?
Yes, that's a very good question. Actually, I suppose really that's the thing I'm concerned about in this research. Ultimately, I mean, I don't know how I'm going to conclude it yet. I mean, it's early days, but I would say that's my real concern. And models. I mean, how many people make models in practice? Oh, you know, very few. You know, the amount of people we get coming back from placement and so on nowadays, they haven't made a model for a year. And I think, you know, that's what concerns me, is that this simulated three-dimensional world that's actually two-dimensional on the screen is deeply concerning, because I think it robs the designer of the opportunity to really investigate what they're doing. I'm not saying that all designers think like that. They don't. I think if you're in command of the software and you're thinking very carefully about the decisions you're making while you're using it, it's fine. But I think it has the potential to rob people of that kind of creative endeavour that you get through sketching and model making.
Thank you, Doug. We have another question by Manuel. Thank you for the rich presentation, Doug. I wanted to pick on the ontology of the hand that you are presenting, especially thinking about digital, which derives its name from digits, evoking fingers and counting. Would there be potential for an understanding of hand and therefore the digital as offering a radically unoriginal point of departure? I ask this as something that can offer us the potential to explore other types of image production and perhaps liberate us from homogenizing modernist and post-Renaissance paradigms of perspective that we often see in architectural representations.
Yeah, well, I think I haven't really touched on it in the talk, but Foscari kind of approaches this in 11 exercises in the art of architecture, and also on his writings on drawing, in that he proposes, you know, some years ago now, a kind of hybridization of the digital and the hand-drawn, which is common practice now. And Foscari kind of launched the ship as a resolution to try and find, you know, ways of combining hand-drawn representation and collage systems for representing the interior and representing architecture along with the digital. And I think, you know, if you think about what's his face, Gordon Matta Clark, or yeah, you know, an artist from the, I think, 70s. Manuel probably be more familiar with him than I am, but that kind of thinking about space and the way that we represent space, you know, trying to represent space in its totality in some way, in the way that we experience it, which is not from a fixed position with one eye shut. It's quite the opposite, in fact. You know, I think finding ways in which we can challenge that notion of the perspective as the kind of golden standard. The more of that, the better, really.
Thank you so much. Any more questions? I have one question for you, Doug. Do you think that we should prioritize any other form of representation other than perspective?
I think orthography does it, quite frankly. This is the conclusion I'm coming to, and I think, again, if we try to find ways in which we can represent the experience of the interior through other means, I think we'll start to challenge the kind of tyranny of not only CAD-based representation systems, but also perspective representations per se. What else was I going to say? Maybe it's gone. I've forgotten it.
We have a question by Carolina. Carolina, you can unmute yourself and ask the question if you want yourself.
Sure. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, Doug, thank you so much for your amazing presentation. I was quite interested in the fact in this kind of articulation between the drawing and reality and kind of this connection you're trying to make, and then also the move to the digital or to these kind of new technologies. And if we were to say that the CGI images, I'm not very well familiar, but from what you said, I understand it is a kind of a translation of data from what is given to the software, and then there's a translation of that, but also an enhancement, which then also serves some sort of kind of more neoliberal purposes in terms of also becoming something that can be acquired, etc., as a projection. So I was just wondering if these images are a projection of something that doesn't exist just yet. If we were to be thinking of data creating and determining the images of the future that we all are drawn towards, but we probably never encounter, according to your idea of deception and a mismatch, let's say, between what is being presented and the actual building that will be built. Sorry, there's a bit of a background noise here. So, sorry.
Yes, okay, I can hear you.
So my question is, how do you see data having a kind of an agency in a way?
Right. God. Yeah, I'm not sure I've really thought that one through yet. If I'm perfectly honest. I suppose I was thinking, I don't know whether this answers your question at all, but I think the main problem I've got is the data at the moment is fixated with generating photographs. Photographs are like time travel, aren't they, at the end of the day? So we look at a photograph from the past, which has captured space in an artificial representation historically, you know, and the light is captured there digitally through a digital camera and kind of reorganized into something that we'd recognize. And the same is true of those digital representations that are data driven in the software that's used to represent space. Essentially, it's producing time travel in that you know, this is a kind of data driven representation of the future, which is kind of interesting in itself. I think what would be interesting is if the data can be real time ultimately, and maybe the data finds itself in our bodies because at some point in the future, because that sense of true augmented reality in some way, rather than, I mean, there's systems where you can kind of hold your phone up and see your new space. I mean, you can even find this on websites where you hold your phone up and you can look at your new bed from Maid or whatever, or Habitat in the space. So that it's only a heartbeat away. And I think that could be really interesting, because I have this horrific vision of us having interiors that are just white canvases and that are entirely data driven, you know, and we select with the blink of an eye what kind of thematic space we want to exist in. So I know it sounds like science fiction, but you know, science fiction is fact within generations, you know, and it's becoming faster and faster. So I think a sort of data driven kind of augmented reality, augmented existence would be fascinating and horrific at the same time. I'm not sure that kind of answers your question, but those are my thoughts.
Thank you, Carolina. Douglas, we have another question. The audience is asking, is there anyone in your opinion demonstrating true authenticity in their work that should be taking precedent from? So anyone that you think like they should like kind of...
Probably not. I think what you'd have to do is look at their axonometrics and isometrics, really. I can't think of a particular person, but certainly that the sort of formality of that process of representation, I think, carries with it greater levels of authenticity than the perspective representation.
Thank you so much, Douglas. I think we will move on to our next guest speakers, which is Saskia, one of our final year students. As mentioned before, her research is about ethnography, activism, and the Old Market Square. I will hand it over to Saskia.
Hi, I'll just share now. Is that sharing now?
You are showing, but it's not full screen yet. Yes, full screen now.
So hi, I'm Saskia, and my research topic for this project was ethnography, activism, and the Old Market Square in Nottingham. So prior to starting this research project, I'd never attended an arranged protest or political event. I'd witnessed them in passing and always been intrigued to get involved, but the opportunity hadn't presented itself. So when setting out to start this project, I wouldn't have predicted that I would be drawn to a small group of protesters in Market Square. So that they're seen in the sketch here. This brief moment where my attention was occupied entirely by what these individuals had to say remained in my mind for the next weeks to come. I found it so interesting that they'd used this public space in the centre of town as their platform, and in result it had a direct impact on me, just an individual passing by. So I wanted to find out more, and as a spatial practitioner, I was really interested in observing how the physical design of Old Market Square had a relationship with political activism. So looking at the Old Market Square itself, it's the second largest public square in the UK. So this scale therefore makes it instantly impressive when you enter from any position. And this sense of monumentality contributes to the symbolism of the space for its political importance within the city. And then looking towards the architecture within the site, the grandeur of the buildings, such as the council house, which is pictured here, adds further to this significance, giving individuals a meaningful social hierarchy when making their standpoint. So the site in front of the council house has also been used as a rallying point for so long that the history itself makes it symbolic. Market Square also houses the first official speakers' corner outside of London, which provides a designated space for debate and discussion, encouraging face-to-face conversation in public space. So what this means for Nottingham is that there is a vast public space that can provide a platform for many acts of political activism. So how it's used depends on the action itself. So in order to further understand how the square was used, I wanted to look towards what the different types of political action were that required public space as a platform. So the main one tends to be public assemblies, which are about voicing a message within public space. So the freedom to occupy this public space is therefore crucial for any fair and democratic society. So it's not uncommon for authorities to use preventing access as a tool against activists. But public assemblies are also usually very scale dependent. So for example, in my studies, looking at the anti-lockdown protest that I witnessed near the beginning, it was comparatively a lot smaller than one of the, say, the Black Lives Matter protests of 2020. But both still chose to occupy the same site of Old Market Square for different reasons. So to go into the anti-lockdown protest a little bit further, so these protesters occupied this space in front of the council house and managed to draw attention to the message despite the group being so small. So as can be seen from my photographs and sketches here, by standing on the steps of the building, the speaker elevated himself above the people passing by, as though he was stood on a stage, like performing to the crowds. So this gained a lot more visibility from across the square. And also, as seen in like the map, so this was my route through the square, and he was using a megaphone to project his voice out into the open space. So I was just walking past and noticed this man speaking, and then it gained my attention. I could see that others stopped to have a look as well, and some were asking questions and some were just taking photos. So from observation, it was clear to see that the message was getting attention it wouldn't have received had it not been located in such a central and well-connected, highly populated position. Whereas larger scale assemblies that occupy the square tend to occupy it for its size, so as it's one of the few locations within the city that's big enough for a group to gather. So another common physical act of political activism is processions. So the main focus when considering these is the direction of voice. So they're much more about targeting specific authorities and being exposed to one another within the locations that are most significant to each message. So in my research, I looked towards the works of architect Tali Hatuka, who said in her book, The Design of Protest, Choreographing Political Demonstrations in Public Space, that context plays a key role in planning protests. So the route of a march, for example, will usually follow a framework of planned locations in whatever space the city provides. So that's considering social, cultural and architectural context. And then marches also gain power through solidarity between the communities they directly touch during the actual act of the procession itself. So then my case study example when looking at processions was the Black Lives Matter March of 2020. And this is a good example where the protest choreography is led by the message itself. So I decided to map the actions of the activist group through the protest. So that's here on the left. And it can be seen here that the action started in Market Square as the crowd gathered at Speaker's Corner. And I speculate that this is down to its point of familiarity within Nottingham as a community. So it's easy to say, oh, let's meet at Speaker's Corner. And also the scale, once again, like it provides enough space for this. And they then marched through the main streets of Nottingham city centre to gain exposure and visibility within the community. And from my research, cars stopped to beat their horns in support and others joined the march as it was moving through. So then the march arrived outside of the police station in Radford and then onto the prison. And this was in order to communicate specific messages with the officials to challenge or sway their decisions in regards to the Black Lives Matter cause, and that's at a local level. And then in complete contrast in my research, I found another example of political activism that uses Old Market Square for what it coined as a peaceful reading flash mob. So Nottingham Black Archive organise an event each year during Black History Month where people are invited to bring and read a book written by a Black author to raise the profiles. So this was particularly interesting to me as the action took the form of sitting together on the steps of the council house and reading, which is a seemingly small and non-political act that gained a lot of engagement from the community, as it's not an everyday activity you'd expect to see. So it's less about communicating an exact message and more about creating awareness for positive social culture. So the act of reading only becomes political because of where they're doing it. So this effect of reading in a public space rather than, say, a library or a bookshop means that Old Market Square itself becomes an important part of the message. So using Professor of Anthropology Seth Lowe's theory of embodied space, which she discussed in her book, Spatializing Culture, the Ethnography of Space and Place, I observed and recorded the movement of people in Old Market Square. So how they pass through, how they linger, how they communicate with one another, how they create visibility and how they perform. So looking at the general movement here on the page now, on an everyday basis, I could see it's very fluid and it pretty much covers the entire square. The square itself is very open, so people move across in all directions throughout the day, as well as stopping to sit along the benches and by the fountains. By then recording the movement during each case study, I could see how the location within the square, the scale of the protest and the type of action had a dynamic relationship with this movement of people. So at the top, it can be seen that gathering in front of the council house takes advantage of the general movement as there's a strong sense of visibility in this location. And the connectivity of the square increases chances of engagement. And then in the second diagram, where the large crowd fills the open space. So when a crowd occupies it in this way, many of the movement pass through the protest, which illustrates the impacts of a large-scale demonstration can have on the general movement of people. So how it uses disruption of these movement paths to its advantage. And then here, so looking at the protest at Speaker's Corner, so they gathered here to gain visibility from the movement paths, as can be seen, but also provides that sort of initial momentum and direction for the march. And then below, the demonstrators gathering at the steps. So this was on a busy Saturday afternoon and it gained lots of exposure from people passing by. And I found this mapping of the movement a really useful tool for sort of being able to compare each case study and kind of make these links. So to conclude, I would say that the relationship between activism and public space is dynamic. And this study is relevant to interior speculations, as these same principles of ethnographic observation can be applied to any architectural project. So it's the importance of understanding the availability and design of spaces with how people use it. So the most successful designs are those that consider the needs of the user and its longevity as a usable space. And then with discussions of the new policing bill on further controlling a protest action, the lines between public and private space may be blurred even more, as activism has to adapt to occupying interior spaces. And as Hatuka suggested, protests are a planned display whereby protesters design and use their available means to express beliefs and ideas. So if the availability of space changes, then the protest action itself will surely adapt. And that's everything. Thank you.
Saskia, because I think we already have 2 questions for you, so we might just spend asking the question from you and then we will move on to Lily. So there is a question from Katie. She's asking, I often find activism take place outside older buildings in town centres. Do you think something has been lost from town centres since buildings of this scale aren't built anymore?
I think that's definitely an interesting point, but I would say, looking at Nottingham as an example, I know that this council house building, it is called the council house, but actually most of the Nottingham council activity happens elsewhere. But because of this sort of historical symbolism of the building, people still go to these locations. So I think, I don't know if the newer buildings in this sort of situation would have the same impacts, because people definitely don't go towards where the new council resides. Like, they definitely stay to Market Square.
You have another question, Saskia. What role do you think Old Market Square played in the anti-lockdown movement?
I think it would definitely be, because I noticed when I was going into town that quite early on, so that would be around October time, nearly every Saturday there would be these anti-lockdown protesters. And I know that I didn't witness any of the larger ones, but there were some really large scale ones. And I think it more just allowed people that were of this opinion in terms of the lockdown to sort of be exposed to one another, so they could see other people had the same views. And then I guess there were people on the other side of it that saw, oh well, there's a lot of people with that opinion. So yeah, I think it probably allowed it to grow more as a sort of a viewpoint.
Okay, so I just kind of like ask you a question, because I have read your research project. Do you think, is there any ideal space for protest that now we are mentioning, like Market Square? Katie's talking about old buildings. So do you think, is there a space that makes the protests and demonstrations successful, or are there other elements that make them successful?
I think there's definitely, I think it's more of, there's elements of it. So it's having this sense of scale, a place where a lot of people can come together. Obviously, it being very accessible and familiar, so people would know where to go. So I think that's where the boundary between it being public and private space makes quite a difference, because by being in public spaces, it's accessible to everybody, and it doesn't close anything off. So I think that would be my answer to that.
Okay. In your talk, you kind of mentioned about performance, and one of the protesters kind of was performing by using the stairs. You mostly kind of focus on how the relationship of architecture and like the space that architecture provides for these protesters. But have you focused on like what these bodies, like now you mentioned that people come together in a public space. Have you thought about like the effect of these bodies coming together within like a public space? What's the effect of the bodies on the space, not the other way around?
I think if I take bits from my research that I did found that kind of linked to that, I know that during the redesign of Old Market Square, so that was in 2007, the architects said they wanted to create a flexible performative space. So I think in that respect, they definitely understood that people use this space in a certain way, so they wanted to design it to sort of encourage that and provide for that. And then also, I guess it's interesting to say there's the speakers corner, which is also quite a new addition, and that's purely for people to gather in person. And so yeah, I think that it definitely just follows in some respect.
Okay. Going back to Douglas's talk and kind of representation and drawings, I wanted to know, how did you record these movement diagrams? Because obviously they are like graphic, they are representing these movements. How did you record them, and what methods did you use?
So unfortunately, because of COVID, I couldn't go to as many of the political events in person as I would have liked. So I was using a lot of online articles and social media and things, and videos and photos, and I found that it made sense to try and take some of this from what I'd found and try and put them all into the same space, into the same image. So I just wanted to record how people, like a frame of how people were together in that space at that time. So that's sort of why I did it. And yeah, it was quite speculative. So I was just using information like about the number of people that attended, photos, videos, all of that sort of thing.
Okay, thank you. Well, we'll see if there are any other questions from audience or from the panel. Do you guys have any question for Saskia? Okay, so our next speaker is Lily Riley, and the talk is on social housing and North Kensington community.
Hi, I'll just share my screen. Okay, let me know that you can see this. Can you see it full screen? Okay. Hi, I'm Lily, and I'm going to talk about my research project, which is about the impact of social housing development on the North Kensington community. So, following the rise in awareness of the Black Lives Matter movement since the murder of George Floyd in May 2020, combined with the tragic incident at Grenfell Tower in June 2017, I wanted to understand further how architecture might facilitate discrimination amongst minority groups. I was already aware that people with disabilities face discrimination in buildings where there is poor access, and that transgender people face discrimination by the restrictive bathroom labelling system provided in most buildings. But I wanted to understand how minority groups, other minority groups, may be restricted by the way their surroundings have been designed. In a society that is built on systemic racism, I wanted to understand and educate myself on how architecture might play a part in that and how I can avoid design that discriminates in my future design work. The methodological approach by which this research was conducted was ethnography based, particularly observing social housing tenants' behaviours and attitudes towards their dwellings. This research method allowed me to understand the cultures, behaviours and customs of a community. I took a digital ethnographic approach as it allowed me as a researcher to observe a community remotely without travelling to observe firsthand. And this was particularly useful because during the length of time we were conducting this research, there were COVID travel restrictions in place. Initially, I was researching discrimination in architecture, and the majority of search results that I found were about the profession being largely dominated by men. But then I came across a panel discussion by Columbia GSAPP about critical dialogues on race and modern architecture, and I've just put the link on here if anyone wants to look at that in their own time. This largely discussed the problems with race and class in the UK. But I wanted to understand how the impacts of how architecture impacts people in the UK. I began looking at other social housing dwellings around Grenfell Tower, and I searched these places online and used platforms such as Twitter to gauge people's opinions of these areas and communities' attitudes to living here. The overwhelming response was that people were unhappy with how over the years the area had gentrified and become unaffordable to people who were born and raised in the area. And this image just shows some discussion online between two people about their experiences of growing up in London and seeing gentrification occur. I came across the work of photographer Nicola Muirhead, who observed the residents of Trellick Tower. Alongside her photography, she also conducted some open-ended interviews with some of the residents, discussing their experiences of living here. And these interviews allow me to see how living in social housing in North Kensington was viewed by its residents. I also have used online articles and council statistics to offer additional and alternate perspectives of life in social housing. The use of these extra sources allowed for more varied opinions, which was typical to a post-structural analysis. I looked at the history of social housing in Britain and found that it was the government's solution to the housing crisis. While this solution may have been successful in the short term, the solution's success did not continue through the subsequent governments. The Thatcher aid further depleted the available social housing market due to the introduction of the right to buy scheme. This allowed tenants to purchase their council-owned homes at a significantly reduced price. In addition, gentrification of urban areas triggered a large migration of wealthy people into cities. As an area grew in popularity, housing prices increased and properties with the original purpose of being affordable shot up in price. Social housing that had been bought through the right to buy now belonged to the housing market, and people moving into the area took advantage of its price. This, however, pushed out local tenants who had been brought up in the area. Prices became so competitive that local people couldn't afford to stay there and had to move elsewhere. Despite the initial intent of social housing to provide affordable living, the changes in financial and political environment pushed out its poorest communities. The map here just shows in light blue North Kensington and in dark blue Golborne Ward, which is where Trellick Tower is located. The architect who designed Trellick Tower, Erno Goldfinger, stated that the whole object of building high is to free the ground for children and grown-ups to enjoy Mother Earth and not to cover every inch with brick and mortar. Some of the features that are pictured here within the interior were designed to facilitate family living. The split barn doors onto the balcony allow parents to keep an eye on their children from the kitchen, and participants also praised the unique design, which involves power cables being concealed inside metal door frames, as well as the Georgian proportions of the rooms. So on these floor plans you can see particularly the larger communal spaces like the living areas, the living room and the kitchen are large proportions. I learned that from the form of the building, this made up of two long thin towers connected by this sort of square section in the middle, were designed this way to reduce the amount of noise residents would receive from services such as lifts and communal spaces, all of which are located in the middle tower block. As you can see, the interior of each apartment was designed to be similar depending on the number of bedrooms and were aimed to be non-hierarchical. Unfortunately, due to the rejection of Goldfinger's request for a concierge, the building was left unsupervised, which immediately resulted in problems such as vandalism, rough sleepers squatting in corridors, prostitution and drugs. On top of this, living in high-rise buildings has been criticised by Alice Coleman in her book Utopia on Trial, as the typical streetscape found in terraced housing is absent. This reduces the number of interactions neighbours have with each other, which reduces the natural surveillance that occurs when community relationships are tight-knit. As a result, this increases the risk of vandalism. Clearly, living with these problems occurring in and around one's home, one's chances of success become restricted. In her book, Why I'm No Longer Talking to White People About Race, Rania Lodge explains that due to systemic racism in Britain, social housing problems in London disproportionately affect people of colour. In Golborne Ward, where Trellick is located, there is a large Moroccan community. Muirhead's interviews of residents in Trellick Tower found that residents feel as though they are being pushed out of their own community. Participants in the interview explained that due to gentrification, the area has become a trendier location, and more wealthy people are moving into the borough to take advantage of the cheaper prices. However, for residents, this means prices get driven up and makes living here unaffordable for them. Another participant explained that in the past there has been discussion that Trellick was going to be sold by the council. When this happens, tenants get decanted all over the country into other social housing developments with no say on where they will end up. Fortunately for the community, this was prevented as Trellick received a Grade 2 listed status. Ultimately, I discovered that for design built around community, reassessment of the design is required to ensure that it's still successful throughout changes in social, cultural and political climates. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Holly. Let's see if we have any questions from the audience while audience getting ready to ask questions. I have my first question. Did you find any limitation completing your ethnographic research digitally?
I actually think that since I don't know the North Kensington area that well, I think completing my study digitally allowed me to gather a more varied range of perspectives, like a wider spectrum of views when I was doing this. So I think it had its advantages.
Okay, I think Douglas has a question. That's why he's put his camera on.
Yeah, find this whole thing really fascinating, and thanks for a really good presentation as well. Really enjoyed what you've been looking at, and I was wondering what your thoughts are on potential future state intervention in providing kind of social housing, because my thoughts are this. I remember as a kid, okay, that my granddad lived in a council house. You know, it was quite a big house, 4-bedroomed, big garden. He had an allotment. There was a dog kennel there where he bred cocker spaniels. Next door to him was the local doctor. The next house along, there was a factory owner. Along from them was another working class family, and it was the most, as a school teacher, it was the most extraordinary mix of people who were renting property, and these were good houses. And it strikes me that somewhere in the mix of all this, all that's been forgotten, and that, you know, if the state was providing, you know, good quality housing to rent, I mean, I don't. What are your thoughts on that?
I think it's difficult. There's like many different types of social housing. I was mainly studying like high rise, and obviously I've said that that has its negative impacts, because like there's a lack of interactions between neighbours. But there's like many other things. Part of my research was like, even if your view to the street is blocked by a garage, or like part of the house sticks out a bit so you can't see, that can reduce surveillance, and then increase like the risk of vandalism. Or like when you have, I know many architects want to have lots of space, like green space for the community to like enjoy, that's not owned by any one person, but there's been arguments to suggest that having this means that because there's no ownership, that land isn't respected. So it's difficult. I think it's a challenge when it comes to designing something, a scheme that's successful. I definitely think that there are them, but I don't think it's in high-rise buildings. I don't think that's, in my opinion.
Do you think if there was more surveillance then, because I think that was, sorry, but that was an interesting, something I'm really interested in. But you know, if people were able to look at each other's properties and look at the street, whether it was in the sky or on the floor, you know, on the ground, do you think if there was more, they were designed in such a way that the surveillance was easier, that people could offer surveillance to each other, you know, could see their kids out playing, or, you know, whatever was going on? Do you think if that surveillance was, I'm not talking about cameras, but actually people just seeing each other and seeing each other's property, do you think that would make it better?
Yeah, I think definitely that would be an improvement. I mentioned like the architect for Trellick Tower, his request for a concierge got rejected, and like even that caused like problems just by having someone at the front desk. So I think if you had people like actively like just making sure everything's okay in the building, that could be something that would be make the design more successful in terms of improving surveillance. Yeah, definitely.
I could talk about this all day, but I'm not going to.
Now that we talked about surveillance and kind of methods of design, Lily, what do you think, what methods of design or construction do you think will make social housing more sustainable?
I think definitely research into sustainable materials is something that would improve sustainability. I think, well, high-rise buildings are like there's projections into, people think that they're going to be built from timber in the future, but I don't know whether that's possible. I also don't think high-rise buildings for living are the most beneficial, but that could be something that would be considered.
Okay, we have a question from Carolina. She says, great presentation. I wonder what your thoughts are on how brutalist architecture and high-rise building have been stigmatized in the UK.
Yeah. My tutor made me watch Clockwork Orange when I was doing this. And I think definitely they've got a negative stigma. And I think partly it has to do with the fact that it's social housing. There's a lot of stigma against and like classism against people who live there. And brutalist architecture isn't always that popular amongst general public, but I don't know, quite a lot of people appreciate it, so I think it just depends.
Thank you, Lily. We have a question from Sam. Thank you for the great talk and presentation, Lily. I wanted to ask if you intend to visit any places from your study or any further sites for potential future research, or for personal curiosity from investigating this typology of social housing?
Yeah, I think that would be definitely something I'm interested in. The photographs of like the interior of Trellick were like really beautiful, so it would be great to go and see, but I'm not sure I'd be allowed inside some hotels. But yeah, definitely, I'd really love to go and like see these places in person. That'd be a great opportunity.
I think there was a question yesterday on the chat that we didn't manage to answer. So I think it's both to you and Saskia. How do you think this ethnographic research helped, or research in general, supported your design studio?
I think it's definitely going to improve my designs and make them more user-centered in the future. And I think it would be really useful to help conduct like client research beforehand to help us get the designs like spot on in terms of like pleasing clients and making successful designs.
What about you, Saskia?
I would say definitely add to that, and then thinking about sort of looking at a community as a whole and figuring out what's missing or what the community already has, so then you can sort of adapt these concepts for the design studio projects to kind of fit to that, I guess, to make it more meaningful.
Okay, let's see if we have more questions. Anything from the panel? Okay, thank you. Oh, Harry has a question. Move on to Harry.
Oh, you just caught me there. Sorry, yeah, I wasn't sure if we had enough time just to squeeze in one more question, but yeah, no. Thanks, both really good presentations. But yeah, I was just going to pick up on something Carolina mentioned as well to you, Lily. I suppose this kind of this perception of new brutalist architecture and the kind of connotations that come with that, I suppose, because you know these kinds of feelings, I suppose, towards brutalist architecture, people had the same feelings about you know, Victorian terraces and things like that way back when as well. And I was just curious about the listing of Trellick Tower in particular, and whether you think that's had any kind of impact, I suppose, on the general demographic of people living there and the general feelings towards the building too. Because I think the listing of buildings in general feels like quite a kind of, you know, well-to-do, quite a middle-class type of thing. And just thinking back, actually, because one of my old tutors, they were involved in the listing of the Barbican there. In London as well, and they had a huge amount of flack from the residents there, but actually a couple of years later the residents were emailing them to apologize, really happy about the listing, but because it's driven the prices of their flats up basically. But yeah, I just wondered if you thought it had any impacts on Trellick Tower in particular, that listing.
I know that I think the listing gave like residents a big sense of like pride for their like surroundings, their like area. They were all like very proud to live there. And I think in terms of like gentrification, it has like the area is more popular because of that kind of aesthetic that's like becoming more popular recently. So yeah, I do think it's like had an impact. Yeah. Thank you.
Now that we have time, I have a question for Saskia. Saskia, obviously we talked about activism and kind of in public spaces. What do you think will make demonstration or a protest like successful? What do you think the protesters' aims are? Why they are using like the public space, not like private space, especially that we are in this digital age that you can kind of do the protest and not necessarily, but you can use your voice online. So what do you think public space gives protesters and demonstrators, and why they use it?
I think a lot of the same things cropped up like in my research, that there's this sort of sense of trying to communicate with like the media as well as the community. So I think having protests, say the ones that are quite large scale, they're going to have much more impact in the media because of them being in public space. And then also I guess there's other types of protests like acts of disruption. So things like the Occupy movement, when they set up these camps in public space purely to sort of disrupt everyday life. And it's a lot harder to try and do that online, I guess, than actually in person. So I think that kind of answers that. And then I also found that there was an example of the Black Lives Matter march, that a lot of the action started online, trying to arrange it, but then it still ultimately ended up in public space because people just sort of wanted to get together and kind of be in one with each other.
Thank you so much. Thank you to both students. I think we will move on to our keynote speaker, Professor Carolina Rito. Carolina Rito is a professor of creative practice research, currently in Research Center of Arts, Memory and Communities of Coventry University. She's also an executive board member of Midland Higher Education and Cultural Forum, and a research fellow at Institution of Contemporary History. Professor Rito is the executive editor of the Contemporary Journal and has published in international journals such as King's Review. From 2017 to 2019, she was the head of public programs and research at Nottingham Contemporary. She holds a PhD in curatorial knowledge from Goldsmiths, University of London, where she also taught from 2014 to 2016. She lectures internationally in Europe, South America, and the Middle East on her research and curatorial studies. Thank you so much, Carolina, for accepting our invitation, and I will hand over the panel to you.
Thank you. Thank you so much for the introduction. And also, I would like to congratulate the speakers of yesterday's and today's event. And obviously, thank you, Nikoo, Esfahani, Nikkar, and also Harry Foley for the very kind invitation to join the IAD Inaugural Symposium Interior Speculations. The program has been absolutely fantastic. And also just a kind word to those of you attending today. So I would like to start by saying that I'm neither an architect nor a designer. As you might have picked up in the introduction by Nikoo, I come to this symposium as a curator and researcher on curatorial studies. However, I hope that it will become apparent in the course of the presentation how our disciplines might connect, and also that they share more than one would have expected at the first glance. Just as a generic introduction to curating and the curatorial, for those of you who might not be familiar with this practice, curating stands for the practices of exhibition making, usually related to museums and galleries, but also in a more open way to the gesture of making public, as a way to generate new understandings and engagements around and about artworks, ideas, objects, artifacts, and affects. Now, the curatorial stands for something slightly different, but not in opposition to curating. The curatorial draws on curating as the practice of organizing exhibitions, but takes it further to apply to making public skills, to the relationship between exhibition and research, between knowledge production and juxtapositions of materials, if you think of exhibitions, obviously, but also in terms of ideas, and between contested narratives and the exhibitionary. So in short, my area of expertise is situated in contemporary debates of contemporary art and curating, asking the question, how is the work with contemporary forms and ideas able to generate new understandings and inquiries about the world in which we live? I guess this is already one of the first things that connects our practices. They strongly relate to the world around us in which we are both intervening and making sense of by engaging with its social, political, economic, and cultural milieu. We are all practitioners contributing to the making of worlds, I would argue, at the same time that we, as practitioners, are situated subjects, that is to say, neither neutral and universal nor individual. Donna Haraway has notably proposed a feminist account of objectivity, and I wonder if this take also speaks to Doug's proposition around authenticity. Donna Haraway's proposition is in terms of proposed a feminist account of objectivity in terms of situatedness and partiality instead of over-encompassing. Adding that, however, partiality as such is not enough, it should be coupled with constant critical investigation. I'll come back to the critical investigation further down the line. So Donna Haraway wrote, and I quote, "Feminist objectivity is about limited location and situated knowledge, not about transcendence and a splitting of subject and object." So see this relationship between subject and object that I think is very interesting for your practices as well as interior architects and designers. And I continue to quote, "It allows us to become unanswerable for what we learn how to see." End of quote. It is in this situated capacity that we engage and conceptualize the world, as we've seen in the presentations throughout these 2 days. What I would like to do today is to explore the importance of research in our practice and how the exploration of an investigative and critical positionality is key for a practice that is not oblivious of its surroundings and is able to intervene instead of react, and opens to new ways of intervention eventually. So in this way, I will not be speaking to the specificities of the field of the interior and its complex debates that I know are incredibly rich, but try and bring our disciplines into a dialogue, a productive content and the contact and the tension, and present some of the work I've been doing in my practice research. So I will then presenting in the first part of this presentation, I'll present some examples from my own practice. I aim to enter this symposium's proposition as a practitioner researcher who in that capacity has been exploring the infrastructural and architectural foundations of how research and practice encounter themselves at a crossroads, and why it is important to sustain a research-informed practice, no matter where we sit in relation to making and or doing. I will argue that research triggers critical tools that sustain and ensure a contemporary and complex intervention in the world. So as I said, I will start with my own practice. My role as curator and researcher has given me the opportunity to explore the potentials of research outside of academia. I want to now give you an account of the work I did between 2017 and 19 as head of the Public Programs and Research Department at Nottingham Contemporary, a contemporary art centre in the Lace Market, Nottingham, which I assume you are all familiar with. Here I initiated a broad experiment asking the question, how does research look like from the point of view of a contemporary art centre? In other words, how is curating advancing new modes of knowledge production? And how was I to foster a research-led institution in the intersection between the cultural sector and the higher education sector? Important to say that the Public Programs and Research is fully funded by Nottingham Trent University and the University of Nottingham. So this is why it's interesting to be asking what is the role of research in the contemporary art institution, given that the resources are also coming from the higher education sector. To situate this inquiry, I launched a research project titled Institution as Praxis that consisted in the curatorial practice and theoretical investigation of a research-led contemporary art center. I'm going to share my screen for a bit. Sorry, not being able to find. Here it is. So I believe you can now see my screen, and I will okay, I think now you can see full screen. Is that correct?
Yes. Yeah.
Fantastic. You can still see full screen or not?
Yes, Carolina, we can see the full screen.
Okay, fantastic. Thank you. So, oh, it's just annoying because the reason I wanted to move. Can you see the next slide or not?
No, if you move from slide, we've not seen the second slide.
Interesting. Okay, so let me change this because for some reason it's not working as expected, which might mean that I need to change the way I was sharing my screen. Apologies. It's just strange because I can't see the screen now. Okay, I believe you are not seeing full screen, so I'll try again.
Now we see full screen.
You see full screen.
And the slides moves.
If I move here, I will be doing this, I think. Okay, I can't go back to the, sorry, I can't go back to the full screen. So what I will do is just to show from the PowerPoint application, okay?
Carolina, do you want to just put it in the chat, and then Ben or Harry might be able to share their screen and just move the slides for you if you prefer?
Because it's just for a short while.
Okay.
I will just use like that. Sorry, apologies for all the information around. I will just make it slightly bigger and I will move on because again, it won't be for too long. Okay, so as I was saying, sorry for the interruption. Institution as Praxis asked the following question. What are the research capacities of curatorial public programming in contemporary art institutions and in contemporary curating? How can a research-led curatorial program in a contemporary art center be developed? How can the cultural sector's curatorial practices inform and contribute to the debates in academic curatorial research? I would like to talk you through briefly the curatorial infrastructure that I have created at Nottingham Contemporary, but not without first explaining what I mean by infrastructure. Yen Kangye, in his presentation yesterday, had already mentioned the importance of Michel Foucault's work when it comes to understand the power structures that traverse modern and contemporary institutions. According to Foucault, these institutions are connected to an apparatus that is not limited to the physical architecture of their buildings, but is a network of power relations. Infrastructure can be what we call apparatus. It doesn't therefore call for a definition, but a map, a cartography, a survey. Infrastructure is therefore more like kind of a network that enables the relationship between identifiable objects. Infrastructure is not therefore a prosaic form of materialism. So this is something we can discuss also in the Q&A. Architect Keller Esterling has written extensively about infrastructural space, pointing out that infrastructures, and I quote, far from hidden, they are now the overt point of contact and access between us all, the rules governing the space of everyday life, end of quote. In that way, institutions are not so much about what they were prescribed to do, as they are about the invention of what they should be serving. And so we should be thinking of our interventions as at an infrastructural level. This is what I would like to argue. In this context, institution as praxis was a way to modify the prescribed function of the public programs and research, to explore the role of research in programming. And again, agreeing with Esterling that the role of art institutions is to be public places or forums for critical discussions and making of contemporary politics. The infrastructures of the curatorial project at Nottingham Contemporary included A, setting up a public program based on research strands. The research strands were institution as praxis, on translations, and critical pedagogies, which I will explore shortly and show you some images. A digital first and commons-based journal. And I'll just show you here also an image of the journal. And C, a series of collaborative research projects fostering a move from research about to research from within the conditions of the institution. So in short, what I mean is to really foster a move from the case study approach towards an implicated and situated one. And here I'm thinking also the positionality of the subject that is conducting the research. Regarding the research strands, I will briefly present some of the activities programmed in each one of them. I will start with institution as praxis. This strand argued that universities are not the only sites of knowledge production, a fact that is as unavoidable as it is exciting, and embraced a research-driven ethos as the basis of the program's inquiries. The curatorial program consisted of 1, public events and closed-door workshops to explore the epistemic functions of galleries and museums. We had guest speakers, including Bach director Maria Lavayova, researcher and writer Andrea Phillips, curator and researcher Anthony Downey, and artist and researcher Bill Velasquez, among many others. The second element of these projects was to bring together some of these accounts as part of the edited publication titled Institution as Praxis, that you can see now in the image, New Curatorial Directions for Collaborative Research. It also included the contributions from, for instance, the Forest Curriculum, Juan Grupa, Joasi Krisa, Bali Maluji, Melanie Butlu, among others. And finally, the third element of this research project, or these research strands at Nottingham Contemporary, was also an advocacy document that we put together with recommendations for collaborative research across both sectors that was shared with the Arts Council England and also the HRC, Arts and Humanities Research Council. Another research trend was on translations. This was a 2-year program investigating the qualities of translation and curatorial practices to map counter histories and networks of cultural production beyond the Western canon. This project also investigated how critical translation can offer methods to the practice of curating in the expanded field of exhibition making. On translation activities included an edited volume on the Contemporary Journal that I showed before, and a series of public events, including the ones I will show you now. I Can Hear the Barbarians by Maria Mona Lisa Garavi. This is a multilingual reading performance incorporating simultaneous translation in Portuguese, Arabic, Spanish, and English, as well as Catalan, Yoruba, Latin, and French inflections. Performers read passages of Syrian Brazilian poet Vali Salomão, his book Algaravia's Echo Chamber. Empty Orchestra by Urok Shirhan. In this work, Shirhan stages a musical performance piece that concerns questions of nationality, synchronization, and belonging. The performance is part of Shirhan's research that considers questions of the voice, the ways in which it is performed, recorded, and made audible, as well as a wider understanding of the tongue as relating to language, phonetics, and dialects. On Translations Conference explored translation beyond the equivalent between languages. Its contributors explored notions of translation and its relations to south-to-south transcontinental solidarities with artist Quincy Gario, poetic confusions in processes of transliteration between languages with poets Ricardo Marques and Ghazal Mossadegh, the politics of cultural erasures in translation with the artist collective Feras Publishing Practices, the provincialization of the institution of subjecthood with artist Rana Hamadeh, and translation as a site of activism and politics with philosopher Stefan Novotny. Cinema and the Anti-Colonial Liberation Struggles was a series of screenings and talks exploring the political solidarities of anti-colonial struggles in Africa and socialist geographies and how cinema helps shape new political imaginaries. We screened some of the films that you can see here in the images, and also we organized conversations with most of the authors involved in this work. Finally, in 2019, critical pedagogists took the centenary of the establishment of the Bauhaus as a prompt to investigate the potential of education beyond modules and timetables, syllabi, and learning outcomes. Thinking of the productive space of education as a site for coming together in curiosity, we launched an independent study program titled Campus. Campus was designed to welcome participants from different backgrounds, disciplines, age groups, and interest areas. Meeting once a month for a year, this forum invited colleagues such as Nora Sternfeld, Elvira Diangani Oze, Gurminda Bambra, Quincy Gario, Anselm Frank, Selena Condorelli, and Tina Kemp to join the conversations. This trend also included a series of events curated with CCA, RCA students from the Royal College of Art in London, and also publications and conferences, including Architectures of Education with eFlux Architecture and also Kingston University. I will now stop sharing my screen and go back to the text. Now I will start the second part of my presentation, where I will be talking about the tensions between practice and research in academia. So as I said before, my role as curator and researcher has given me the opportunity to explore the potentials of research outside of academia, more specifically in the cultural sector, as I've just illustrated. What I would like to bring to your attention now is my commitment to the potentials of practice as research within universities, with a particular attention to the porosities between HEIs, higher education institutions, and the industry, and the contributions to one another. If claiming research from the institutions of display, i.e. museums and galleries, generates a new paradigmatic response beyond the study of collections and into a generative critical infrastructure, a similar tension emerges when claiming practice as research or practice research from academia. However, the latter requires more than just a simple translation or adaptation to the protocols of research validation, a translation that is sometimes assumed as the best routine for practice. I would like to use this opportunity to offer my views about the tectonic movements in the field of practice research and the work we are doing in the critical practices strand I lead at Coventry University to foster a critical, propositional, and speculative approach to practice research. Practice research in academia is a contested field, not so much because it is new and we are still trying to figure out what to do with it, but because academics seem to tendentially disagree with what it means, what to do with it, and moreover, how to validate it as research. Just to be clear, practice research refers to the research that is conducted via the means of practice. However, not any kind of practice, I would argue. So when we say practice, we do not always mean the same thing. One could argue that practice has been long part of academic research, be the practice of writing, the practice in the lab, the experiments, the field work. However, the practice I'm interested in is not the practice of conducting research or any of the practical activities that go into its development. Rather, the practice of practice research that I want to explore here includes a serious understanding of aesthetic and epistemic operations beyond lexical declarations and observable events. In other words, a research that is not subsumed by what can be explained in words and evidenced because observable. So this definition of practice research applies to many disciplines within the realm of art and design. I do not have the ambition to speak on behalf of a general circumscription of practice, but the one that refers to the genealogies and traditions of the visual arts in particular. But hopefully they will connect with your practice too. So for clarity, I will be using the term practice research instead of artistic research, because I do not want the conversation to be framed within art practice only. I am therefore addressing the kinds of practices that emerged from the post-conceptual turn, and yesterday we had again in one of the presentations an eloquent presentation of precisely post-conceptual art. So as I was saying, which resulted in the opening up of the doing of practice to a wide array of media, including curation, performance, sound, writing, and others. Although the phrase visual arts still retains the ocular centrism of modernity, which values the visual over the other senses, this arena has long become a site of inquiry through materialities that reach way beyond the specificity of the medium or the visual. It is therefore a post-medium practice research that we are talking about here, despite its affiliation with the traditions of visual arts, and I would include here also spatial practices. So the contributions to the demediumification of the field came from debates taking place in philosophy, decolonial and feminist studies, as well as art theory. I would like to highlight a few important characteristics of these practices. In the mid-20th century, the philosophical arguments of the post-structuralists suggested that the work and the author were to be decoupled, since contextualizing elements such as the biography and the intentions were conditioning the way the work was being perceived, and moreover, what the work was able to explore beyond the author's intentions. And I think this is very kind of familiar to all of you here, because it's true that designing a particular space doesn't mean that is going to be used according to the initial intentions. So this is very much what I'm talking about here as well, the decoupling between the intentions and what the work actually ends up doing. In this way, the work was not perceived as being the representation of a real subject matter, but a maker of reality in and of itself, where ultimately the author is as a spectator as the audience of the work. In addition, the text, work, or artwork as representation of the subject matter was no longer in fidelity to the author's intention. And actually, that intention was, if anything, just preventing the work from working. In that way, the field of visual arts enters into a more prolific dialogue with critical theory. Part of this process are the debates taking place in decolonial and feminist studies, as I mentioned before, but here I would like to specify, namely the problematization of the seeming Western hegemonies of systems of knowledge production and sense making, including its complicities with the colonial project that established universal principles of time and history and of ontological difference, i.e. gender, race, ability, culture, identity. Some of these issues were already mentioned throughout this symposium. And the second one is the critical assessments of the positionality of the subject as a monolithic and hermetic. The subject is understood as both being an invention for the sustainability of individual capitalism based on property and exploitation of difference. Thinkers and practitioners move towards a multiple and intersectional subjectivity, which is acknowledged as part of a network of social and political constructs, away from the eye of individualism and ideals of liberal humanism. However, all of these advancements, practice research in the field of visual arts is surprisingly still informed by modern constructs of authenticity, goes back to Doug's presentation, originality, authorship, and clarity. Moreover, within the current imperative of metric evaluation, which relies upon statistical equivalence, in other words, everything can be compared as long as it can be quantified into a statistic, practice finds itself in a rather complicated situation. Within the neoliberal paradigm, I have identified 3 ways in which practice has been given permission to enter into the business of research. However, none of them, in my view, comes without setbacks, and I will explain shortly why. The first and most notable one is based on the old assumption of the authorship of the subject, who in their own expression create something original, self-centered, and autonomous. But as critical theorist and media philosopher Gary Hall, director of the Center for Post-Digital Cultures at Coventry University, argued, the assumption of originality and authorship is based on liberal humanism, that the free expression and experience of the individual subject suffices to sustain originality and to ground authorship and also ownership. These premises entail the continuities of modernity constructs of the liberal subject who can assess and access their experiences and feelings. The second permission to practice comes from the neo-positivist conception of research, understood as a move from secrecy to transparency, from abstraction to efficiency. This imperative goes hand in hand with the neoliberalization of art practices, driven by a belief in its affirmative role in society, a problem-solving and service provision. In this order of things, practice is seen as promptly providing impact, evidence, and effective dissemination. Finally, the third permission is when practice research is not leading the call of research, but as an add-on or case study, including in the methods deployed by the so-called more rigorous disciplines, from social sciences to engineering, etc. Here, the arts are seen as providers of a set of new creative variables to be observed and evaluated as case studies according to the disciplinary frameworks of the lead discipline, not of artistic disciplines. Although collaboration between disciplines is always welcome, the fact that these 3 permissions have monopolized the validation of practice has paid a significant disservice to the field. This tendency has compromised the development of key aspects intrinsic to practice research in the arts. Because contrary to protocols of research validation, I would say practice research is partial and errant, is tentative and opaque, and moves through the radical incompleteness of the subject matter. It does not produce a final and conclusive output that can be clearly disseminated and cannot be formalized in pre-established templates. It is driven by the conditions of the materials at stake, be it infrastructural, epistemic, ecological, and the constraints and inevitabilities of the unplanned encounters, so contingency also being incredibly important. It invites the formation of communities of concerns in solidarity against the assumption of audience segments. It is always in collaboration, and it is radically interdependent of all the past, present, and future dialogues with others and our multiple selves. It is fidgety and embraces the complexity of the conditions in which we live. Practice research in the arts is conducted by the constellation, operation, and manipulation of materials in its partiality, fragmentation, and obliqueness. It generates points of entry into complex accumulation of matter. The questions are driven by urgencies and uneasiness in the face of those things that are not yet known or need to be undone or thought otherwise. Inquired from a different entry point, disclosed to tease out what was not yet there. Most of the times the researcher is also under research as they are part of the research, as in the matter that is being undone by theory and practice. In response to the need to advocate more effectively for a critical, propositional, and speculative practice research and appropriate evaluation mechanisms, the critical practice research strands that I lead at the Center for Arts, Memory and Communities at Coventry University is committed to bringing together practitioner researchers in the fields of visual arts and the curatorial, interested in working across disciplines and exploring speculative interdisciplinary inquiries. Our research engages with visual, oral, haptic and textual materials to critically address the ways we produce knowledge, engage with contemporary societal primacies, and advance new propositional and political imaginaries. To finally conclude, I just wanted to explain why the critical in critical practices, especially after so much scrutiny around critique, or why, despite the critique of critique never stops being relevant. The use of critique in critical practices research strand that I'm leading at Coventry is underpinned by three principles. The first one is that critique is not the same as criticism. It's quite important to stress. The second one is that critique is able to do the work of decomposing the power structures that sustained the naturalized regimes of truth and their symbolic orders. And the third point is that critique is not only a debunking exercise, as many would point out, it also stands for the doing of transformative practices. As curator and theorist Irit Rogoff, one of the most influential thinkers in my work, wrote in a text about the move from critique to criticality, and I quote, "The point of any form of critical activity was never resolution of problem solving, but rather heightened awareness," end of quote. The point of criticality is not to find an answer, but rather to access a different mode of inhabitation of the complex milieu in which we live, which is always different but radical interdependent. Rogoff wrote, and I quote, "It is thus that research moves from being a contextual activity that grounds the production and exhibition of art to a mode of inhabiting the world in its own right. Equally, conditions become a methodology rather than subject matter and produce possibilities for characterizing our state of affairs through the forms of our work." And maybe this is something we can discuss as well, what those conditions are that become part of our methodology. So I come to this symposium as an outsider, really, as you noted, but I hope that my arguments around research and practice convey the importance to generate and nurture critical tools, no matter where we sit in relation to practice. For that to happen, it is important to keep research as a way to enter the complicated entanglements we inhabit, as a tool to support our practice in activating new infrastructures for life forms, sociabilities, and ecologies. Thank you for listening.
Thank you so much, Carolina, for your great talk. Let's see if there are any questions from audience. I have one question for you, Carolina, because you kind of talked about how universities are not the only site of knowledge production. So do you think by universities and cultural institutions coming together, it will help advancing new research methods in academia?
Yeah, thank you for your question. I mean, the answer would be, in short, yes. And I think that's what Institution as Praxis project was trying to advocate for, but not only advocate, also to produce a body of knowledge that could sustain that argument. So what happened at Nottingham Contemporary was kind of very, I think is a quite unique constellation of things, and I should give a bit more context because I didn't have the opportunity during the presentation. But as I mentioned, the public programs and research came about thanks to the fact that both universities decided back, 10 years ago when Nottingham Contemporary first opened, to contribute to the project, and in the particular fashion, which was to launch and to open a new department within non-Im Contemporary that would be fully funded by both universities. So the question that generates immediately this particular articulation that is unique, not only I think in the country but elsewhere, is the fact that you have a three-way partnership with institutions that are not necessarily trying to inform the agenda of programming that happens at non-Im Contemporary, but eventually allows us to ask the question, how is research operating? What is research within and from the cultural sector, from the art institution perspective? And so instead of thinking, okay, let's be sort of a shop window for the research that is being conducted in both universities, or kind of just becoming this sort of bridge between the sectors, what we did was to create what I argue are the curatorial infrastructures to have this experiment where what we're trying to do is to kind of push a bit the borders of what is legitimized, say, in academia as being research, and even what are the realm of possibilities in the cultural sector, because the cultural sector, important to mention, is that our activities, well, now I'm back to academia, but still, I mean, very much involved with a lot of colleagues in the cultural sector, being myself a curator. What the drive really in the imperative is for growth, is for delivery. So you don't quite have time to, you know, exercise any sort of self-reflective, let's say, approach to your practice, let alone research. So the possibility here was really to, by claiming research, I would argue what we were doing was to say that we need a different time, we need a different approach to programming, and eventually we are going to push for the development of, yes, new modalities of research, but also practice, as you mentioned, that necessarily came out of this constellation.
Before I hand over to Ben, I have another question. Obviously, like institutions such as like NTU now, they have on their agenda decolonizing the curriculum. So how do you think this collaboration with cultural sector will help like institutions such as NTU to kind of achieve this?
Wow, that's a very good question. I think it's a big challenge. What's going on, well, worldwide, we could argue, but especially what happened last year and the acceleration of the discussions around decolonial practices. We understand, we see institutions being under scrutiny, and they should be definitely under scrutiny, precisely in terms of equality and diversity. So what institutions are trying to do is, and I hope it was clear in my presentation as well, I understand that institutions are necessarily flexible and performative, or they should be at least. And what we see happening is that institutions that have very fixed modes of operation, let's give the example of a museum such as the British Museum, whose identity is based on a very colonial framework. So how to deal with decolonial practices when all your legacy and all your trajectory is truly and very much intertwined and embedded within these legacies. And this is a major question, and I think this is what everyone is trying to come to terms with. Although it's important to say that we should be having those conversations in a way that they don't come, or they don't result in a kind of just yet another formulaic module or learning outcomes that then are applied across the board. We have to acknowledge first that there's a lot of work done on this particular matter, be it in education, be it in museums, be it elsewhere. So I think one of the most important things is really to open up the conversation, to open up the discourse, and to recognize that this discussion needs to necessarily be plural in order to avoid another tokenistic approach. So I would say that definitely within visual arts, it's been a topic for many, many years. And so it would be interesting to probably foster or trigger a more productive and more intense conversation between partners that have already some experience in precisely handling and also generating these kind of inquiries. So, well, if I understand your question correctly, if your question was in the direction of have should then a conversation, a relationship with cultural institutions happen within the decolonial move in the school curriculum. I think that inevitably yes, but also with other peers that again have been incredibly committed to these issues and should be part of the conversation.
Thank you so much, Karen. I think Ben had a question. Ben, do you want to ask your question?
Yes, thank you, Carolina. That was an incredibly detailed talk, and thank you to everyone as well, across both evenings. It's been some really good research and some really interesting discussions. So I had a couple of questions, if I may. The first was, I suppose, within the context of the architectural design world, we have a kind of increasing favour for advancing the field through practice. The Royal Institute of British Architects themselves actually support through a research fund. And with that in mind, I find it quite interesting that you refer to yourself as a sort of outsider, as neither an architect or a designer. Through my interpretation, I suppose, of the curatorial, it seems as though you are kind of within the realms of design and the processes that it entails, which is quite nicely, I suppose, following on from the student-led conversations that we've had as well. So my first question is, in that sort of context, is it perhaps the case that we can consider all spatial designers as curators of space and of life, but that I suppose the balance of that overlap is only formalized by our personal expectations of what that role or title or person is or should be?
Very good question, Ben. Shall I go for you said you had a couple of questions, but shall I just address this one first?
Yes, please do.
Sure. Very good question. I think I'm going to give a quite long-winded answer, because I think one of the things I would like to see happening within the realm of practice is not only demediumification, as I mentioned, but also deprofessionalization of practice. In which way? And I will explain. When I'm thinking of practice research, or when I'm thinking of critical practices, this is kind of probably a dangerous move, but I think there's some potential there, is that we can meet within these critical practices coming from different disciplines. So I'm not saying that we would get away with training and, professional training or any kind of also academic degree. But I would say that more important to me, being named a curator or an architect or a designer, is the ways in which we enter the research question. And what I mean by this is that what I think that practice allows is for us to be able to situate our research questions and to say that, yes, indeed, I have these particular tools that I, gained from doing this and that degree or that professional experience. But more importantly, I think, is to understand what to do with them to advance practices that really can contribute critically to the constellation of factors and things in which we inhabit that are always incredibly complex. So basically, I think that more than saying who is what, I would like to see us thinking of the curatorial as not necessarily a set of professional skills, but actually as a modus operandi. And that modus operandi, or that way of working and engaging with research and practice, would be one that first and foremost identifies the subject that is conducting the research as a situated one, as I mentioned, not as a universal, all-encompassing, neutral being that is able to understand in a totalizing way, everything that is going on. And I think here we have to acknowledge that architecture has a tendency to give that sort of neutral, but also bird-eye view perspective that is, also very much theorized by colleagues as being kind of a perspective, not only ocular centrist, but also that was produced by the idea of modernity, that also chimes with surveillance and also occupation of the territory through the colonial project. So just to go back to the idea that we enter as individuals these complexities from a situated positionality, which is not the individual identity, but is the acknowledgement that we come with the differences and they also need to be put into the equation at the same time that we are transformed by research. So this is not only a process of getting things clearer, is also a process of getting, I think, coming to terms with our own mess and questions that we cannot answer. And so eventually tools that come from different disciplines can be brought together and advance a kind of response that can be, complex and fragmented, as I said before, but I think the curatorial can enable that. And I think that's why I'm still sticking to it.
That's really interesting. Thank you. It's like I said, it's such a wide subject. There's so many, I suppose, answers that you could almost dive into there. But that was a really good answer. Thank you. The second question I had kind of touches a bit on some earlier topics that we had with Doug. So you talked earlier on infrastructure in relation to the curatorial, and as was mentioned earlier with Doug, we're kind of seeing this very rapid development of evolving digital infrastructures, which are now sort of bridging the tangible and intangible realities. So taking augmented reality as an example of this, the rules between interaction and experience seem to be changing and shifting, and potentially offering alternative experiences to people, which are a bit more tailored and individual as opposed to shared. So my question around this is how do you see such technologies developing, particularly in connection to Foucault's thoughts on apparatus as a network of power more than a physical entity?
Mm-hmm. Oh, that's a very difficult one, to be honest. Is a bit out of depth in terms of also how this technology works in your field. I was very, very interested in Doug's presentation precisely because of that sort of decoupling between real and reality, or visuality and real. It was interesting to see how those representations, I think, are no longer representations, because they actually generate necessarily new visuals, but more than that, new realities. I mean, I think probably new experiences, we could say. I'm not exactly sure in which capacity those images that the CGI, I'm looking at my notes because obviously I'm not familiar with this, but CGI, if I got it right. I think one of the things, I mean, I have a couple of friends, authors on my desk currently, and as I was preparing also for this presentation, and I mean, I quoted Keller Esterling, and specifically the book she has on extra statecraft, The Power of Infrastructure Space, and I think that's how I understand infrastructure. So what she's saying is that infrastructure goes beyond the physical building, what we identify as being things, let's say, and what she's tapping into is more the connectivities, the potential performativities between objects and things that we identify. So she gives a bit the example of you enter a room, you have a desk, a table, a lamp. The table is designed in a particular way because it's meant for someone to sit at it. So it kind of involves already an operation, a performance, a presence, and a function. The chair also has a particular scale in order to be able to be, put next to the table, and the lamp eventually, when the sun is after the sunset, obviously it will be the action of switching on the light. So all these kind of gestures and potential, let's say, or virtual actions are also part of what she calls infrastructures. And so it's a quite open in a way, quite sometimes intangible. And you mentioned also the tangibility and intangibility of infrastructure, and also in relation to power structures. So if we consider that this is what we have, so if we consider that infrastructures are also the things that run in between the things we identify, necessarily everything that Doug talked about in terms of the virtual or this kind of data-driven imagery, this is all part of our reality as much as any kind of in-person experience. This is what I would argue. So I don't think we do any service to ourselves by keeping the divide between reality and non-reality, or even the virtual, or say the digital, being kind of something separate from our real experience. I mean, we saw with the COVID, with the pandemic, and with the move to the digital and acceleration as well of the presence of the digital in our lives, we saw these comments over and over again. Oh, this is not the same. You know, real life experience is different. Meeting on Teams, Zoom, etc. is not the same. Well, I would definitely subscribe. It's definitely not the same. But maybe what we also need to be asking is, what is it enabling? What are the affordances of these experiences? Because they are as real as anything else. We were already in the digital. We were meeting with our phones next to us, and like checking our next meeting or texting a friend. So it is very much embedded, and I think this is what colleagues call post-digital cultures, which is beyond that divide and very much kind of, I think, embracing the fact that this is part of our reality as anything else. But I'm not sure if I answered, because I can't really tap into the architecture, I think, domain in that regard.
No, again, amazing. That's a really good answer, and it's one of those topics that I know I could divert into so many tangents with as well. So I won't for the sake of time, but thank you very much for sharing your thoughts on that.
Oh, thank you for your question.
I think Douglas has a question.
Well, actually, I just wanted to point out there's a question there on the feed.
Yeah, I've seen it. Yeah. I'm going. So, do you have a question?
Yeah, I feel like I'm stumbling about a little bit, Carolina, because your talk was incredibly thorough, very rich, and absolutely fascinating at the same time. And I feel that the proposal of research arcing out to other environments from academia is a fascinating one I've not really thought about, actually, and it's a fascinating opportunity. What do you think? What kinds of freedoms explicitly do you think this kind of collaboration can generate? Because speaking personally, I've found the straitjacket of working in a university stifling over the years. You know, I mean, I remember when I first started to produce research or started to get interested in it, practice research was a bit like, you know, you don't want to be doing that. Write about it, write about something. And so I kind of got into that mode of production. So I wrote, and it wasn't really the thing I was born to do, particularly as somebody who's dyslexic. You know, my mode of production is to make, is to produce. And in some ways, as retirement looms, I'm quite looking forward to having time to produce again, to practice more in more depth. And I understand that practice as research is becoming more respected, more acknowledged, and so on. But I think what I'm curious about, in a very clumsy way, is kind of what freedoms do you think there are for somebody like me in collaborations that you've discussed?
Sure, thank you. So I couldn't agree more in terms of how it's an interesting one, Doug, because I think everyone in academia and in practice research and familiar with practice research would acknowledge that practice research doesn't come as a surprise to anyone any longer, right? So everyone knows that it exists. Let's say it's legitimized, is recognized, etc. Okay, even according to REF, the Research Excellence Framework, there's a lot of very interesting guidelines for practice research. I would say that they are incredibly open to the nature of practice research. I think the problems emerge when we have a tendency in academia to have kind of people that need to manage certain processes, such as REF, but also such as impact, such as research development through bidding and funding applications. And when it comes to this, what's interesting is that you don't see people from practice leading these processes, okay? So although our universities, NTU and Coventry, for instance, I would say they have a tradition of practice, okay, because of his history. When it comes to translating these institutions into research-driven institutions or institutions that conduct research and promote research, what we see is the model coming from hard sciences, from STEM disciplines. And so it's the evaluation metrics, right? So we see our discipline being assessed according to as any other science would be. And I know that there are people in the field, namely the chair of the unit of assessment 32, that is for art and design, for the REF exercise, that says that research is research is research. So there's no difference between different practices within research, which is not true. And so what happens is that colleagues struggle really to make the point to, I would say sometimes, I mean, I tell this to my colleagues at Coventry, sometimes it's a matter of confidence, is that we feel like the way our practice should be advocated for in a completely different way, but because of the openness of practice as well, we feel like we don't have the arguments to counter argue when, you know, traditional disciplines come and say, well, that's not rigorous enough. Well, but who is judging rigor here? Who is determining what are the criteria and assessment criteria for rigor? So I think it's a complicated one. I think there are colleagues definitely in the field that are kind of, you know, being very supportive of this, but unfortunately the machine of, you know, like the bureaucracy that also comes with all these processes tends to be quicker than a proper reflection around this. What I would say is that we need to be stronger advocates, and I think we need to be able to always put practice leading the research and not as an illustration of the theoretical bit that was done eventually here and there. So I think it's an ongoing conversation, really, and there are some forums. I mean, I can obviously drop you an email about that, but there are places where people are really, really committed to these discussions and trying their best to support practice as it should.
Karina, we have a question from audience. It's a long question, so I will read it to you. Thank you for the presentation. My question is posited with the current climate of aversion toward critical thinking within contemporary and neoliberal academia. This climate aims to turn research into a micromanaged process or attempt to remove it completely from university life, i.e. from pedagogy. Because research is perversely deemed as useless, often in terms of employability. On the other hand, as you have presented, institutions are producing research beyond the boundaries of academia. How do you read this paradoxical situation where contemporary academia is abdicating from one of its most crucial tasks, while the so-called real world that academia supposedly caters for sometimes demonstrate a more sophisticated position that grasps the crucial importance of research and practice?
Wow, that's a very complex question as well, and I think it ties in with Doug's question in a way. What are the freedoms? And I didn't answer. Sorry, Doug. I didn't necessarily touch on that particular point that you mentioned. I mean, we are at crossroads, as we know, and especially here, I'm speaking from my sector. We know that there's huge cuts for art education, 50% cuts for art education across the country, and we know that the message is that dead-end or low impact disciplines should be defunded. So it's a complicated moment, because we also know that humanities, art and humanities, has been a field that has been particularly under scrutiny as well, with the same kind of arguments that there's not kind of profitable, impact is not big enough, because yes, this is also the area where we see a lot of the critical thinking coming from. And this is absolutely, I mean, I don't think this is arguably even, this is absolutely seminal, imperative for any society, and especially for us to navigate the complexities of today. I mean, you know, like without critical tools, how can you understand the last 16 months? It's impossible. So we really need to be exercising, and within academia and elsewhere, exercising the more the possibilities for us to become independent thinkers and be able to articulate things otherwise. So, I mean, what this question is pointing at is exactly what's the systemic situation, and also the level in which the work we are doing, which is a bit counter this neoliberalization of academia, it's more and more difficult, and especially considering that education should be the site for these tools to be developed. So I think there's a lot of conversations happening in the field towards a more sort of vocational learning, and thinking more of market-driven or industry-driven disciplines and degrees. It's interesting because it's as if we are putting everything that we have developed so far aside and thinking that we can all be makers and serve the industry or even the market. Well, the market is not a person, doesn't have a particular, you know, is really a random sort of driver that will go towards whatever speculates and makes it grow, which means that politically speaking, it's incredibly dangerous. So I think we need to be putting our foot on the door really as much as we can in order to make these conversations happen, in order to create the spaces, because our institutions, they have space, and this is a bit what I think of cultural institutions, is really to be able to render their infrastructures, and now I'm thinking of physical rooms like the building, render their infrastructures available for those who need to meet and have these discussions, as well as doing and making. But I think this is definitely the role of every single institution, is to provoke and to promote, well, critical practices, but critical pedagogies, which I think that's what the question here, this comment, is hinting towards.
Thank you so much, Carolina. I think we'll see if there are any more questions. If not, thank you so much. We'll close the session. Thank you to everybody who came here, to you, Carolina, and all of our students, and everyone who attended. And have a lovely evening. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you, Nikoo.
Thank you. Thank you. Bye.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.